Welcome to the latest installment of the Overseas Press Club's How I Did It series. I am Patricia Cranz, the Executive Director of the OPC. Today we are delighted to welcome a team of journalists from the Associated Press who won this year's OPC's Malcolm Forbes and Morton Frank Award for their series on global surveillance titled Made in America, Watched Worldwide. The series also won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. So congratulations all. That's quite a record. Mary Rajkumar, AP's Global Investigations Editor and a governor of the OPC, will moderate the discussion. The group will explain how they uncovered the cross-border reach of surveillance systems, worked with sensitive sources, and verified complex technical findings under pressure. The panelists are Dake Kang, Garance, Burke, and Byron. Dake is well known to those of us at the OPC. In 2016, he was a winner of an OPC Foundation Scholarship. And this is his second OPC award. He was part of an AP team that won the 2020 OPC Roy Rowan Award for Best Investigative Reporting for a piece called China Cracks Down during the COVID era. Burke is a global investigative journalist with AP based in San Francisco. She focuses on artificial intelligence and government accountability. Byron is an investigative reporter in AP's Washington, D.C. bureau. He focuses on reporting stories about national security, law enforcement, technology, and government accountability. The panel will talk for about half an hour and then take questions. Please put your questions in the chat at any time. Mary will now take over. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. So this project is about how surveillance technology, and I found this horrifying, is reshaping lives in China, but also in dozens of other countries, in Gaza, in the United States, in ways that most of us are not even aware of. And it comes at a critical time because, as we all know, these are now some of the biggest and most powerful companies in the world, and under the Trump administration have only grown more so. So I will cut straight to the chase and enlist our reporters. So first off, I think it might be helpful to say a little bit about how this whole project started. So, Dake, I am going to throw that to you. Can you tell us how you got interested in this, and in particular, how you found out about the pivotal role played by IBM?
Sure. So I have been following and reporting on a crackdown in China's far west Xinjiang region since I came to China in 2018. Basically, there was a mass detention campaign where the Chinese government rounded up hundreds of thousands, if not over a million, Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in the region. And they were using a lot of technology to do it. And at the time, it was very poorly understood. But we were getting a sense of what was going on from people who were trickling out of the region and telling really bizarre stories at the time. To us when we would visit places like Kazakhstan to get access to those people. And they would say things like, oh, for example, I remember very vividly interviewing someone who was whose brother or whose sister was detained in Xinjiang. And she said something along the lines of, I heard that their score was too low. So they were flagged as being suspicious and detained. And I was like, what on earth does that mean? Like your score is too low? Now obviously we've written the whole series and we've basically figured out what was going on. But at the time, it was really like, oh, this is 1984 in the flesh, right? I mean, it was just so bizarre. And it just planted this seed in my head for a long time. It was something that I really wanted to get to the bottom of. And, you'd have pieces come out, but it wasn't entirely clear what the full story was necessarily. And then a few years ago, freelance journalist Yael Grauer approached me. She was introduced to me by a mutual source of ours with a massive cache of documents that illustrated some of what was going on because it was actually the contractor that had built the system for the Xinjiang authorities. I pounced on the opportunity to figure out what was going on. We went through the documents together, and that's when we realized that a lot of these signs pointed towards IBM because these documents came from a security contractor that was a former IBM partner. So then we started digging into the role that IBM played, and that led me to more sources. And then I got a second cache of internal documents that revealed that IBM had actually been quite pivotal in constructing China's surveillance apparatus from the very beginning, way back decades ago, along with a slew of other American companies. So that's kind of how this all started.
Got it. I think I would say that two of the most surprising things in this project that we found was how Silicon Valley didn't just play a role here, they largely designed and built China's whole tech surveillance system. And B, that Silicon Valley has in the past said, well, we can't help how our technology is used. And we showed that they actually had a very good idea of how the technology was going to be used, and in some cases marketed it specifically to be used to distinguish Uyghurs from Han Chinese, etc. And we also found that that was really just the start of the story. China has since exported that technology for authoritarian purposes to dozens of countries. And Silicon Valley also is using the same technology in Gaza to decide essentially who gets killed. And horrifyingly, back in the United States on US citizens. So, Byron, let me throw that part to you. Um, you and Garance worked on a story about how the US Border Patrol is now using surveillance technology on not just on immigrants, but also on US citizens far from the border. Can you talk a little bit about how the origins of that piece of it, how that came out of it?
Sure. So I think, if I'm remembering correctly, you kind of came to us with the question of, well, how is this kind of technology that we're seeing being used in China and Nepal and in Gaza, how's that being applied in the United States? And immigration was certainly one of the hot topics as the Trump administration took over. So Grant and I, and this was truly a team effort, spent a lot of time sort of in the early stages of just reading and prospecting. So at one point, we went to a bunch of courthouses in the Washington and San Francisco areas and enlisted some colleagues down in the Southeast to look at these court petitions that described immigrants and being arrested to see if there was any indication of what technologies were being used there. Then we started looking kind of at the DHS policy documents, like what technologies does this agency describe using on the American populace? And one thing about DHS is that when it was set up after 9/11, it did have a very strong privacy component. Congress mandated that it have a privacy office and that privacy office publish a great deal of information about its technologies and how they're being used. So we read a lot of those policy documents. And then we started calling around. We started calling around to lawyers who worked on immigration cases. We started talking to the defense bar, and we started reading court documents. And one of the things, I'm sort of an obsessive collector of tips, even as I go about reporting other stories. And one of the things that a lawyer had told me a very long time ago when I was working on something very different was that, down in the border region, most reporters in New York or Washington or San Francisco don't really have any idea of how this area is policed. Um, so, that kind of theme stuck in my head. Like, what's happening in this border region, in this big zone, especially along the southern border, but also along the northern border. The other thing is, I just remembered this case in San Antonio, Texas, of just a random motorist who was stopped. He had his car torn apart for no discernible reason. And so, I just kind of remembering these two things, I just started reading that case and a bunch of other court cases down in the Texas and California and Arizona area. And in a couple of those documents, but notably in this case in San Antonio, as you started reading through these thousands of pages of of court documents, which included testimony, which included text messages, you started to see how the border region was policed. You started to see that the Border Patrol was actually a big presence, had to have deep relationships with law enforcement in Texas and in Arizona and in California, that they were passing tips back and forth about motorists that they considered suspicious. And so this was kind of the start of unwinding this program, and a lot else went into it. I can let Garance talk about other parts of the reporting. That was kind of the genesis of us starting to dig into exactly what was happening inside the United States and getting the sense that it wasn't just traditional policing of looking for a known suspect, that they were doing something that looked a little bit like what was happening in more authoritarian countries, like looking at people's behavior and singling them out with sort of a risk score or a behavioral pattern that indicated suspicion, and then finding a reason to pull them over.
So, Garance, I'll throw it to you to say a little bit more about the many methods we use to find documentation on this. But also, I wanted to talk about sourcing. Garance, you cover AI for the AP, and one of the challenges with AI is that it can be quite a technical subject. So, would you also talk about how we found human sources to humanize this technology story? So, Garance, over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. So I think that one of the challenges is that these technologies really are quite complicated. And so we all wanted to make sure that our reporting was just very detailed and nuanced and accurate, whether we were writing about the hardware that was used, say, for example, in the Border Patrol story, these automated license plate cameras, which, essentially we found are like hidden in traffic cones around Arizona, or whether it was a very complicated AI models that were being used to help guide bombing decisions in Gaza. And so we consulted a lot of different experts who helped us really parse the difference between the hardware and the software and how those things interacted. And we also employed some different kinds of records requests in order to get at this. So, for example, with the Border Patrol story, we had heard that the Border Patrol had to ask state agencies for permission to place its automated license plate readers on state-owned land. And so we went after that at the state level. And that ultimately gave us this really granular view of where these cameras were. And we were able to send out a photographer to get photos of them. Um, but I think in all of this, of course, as you mentioned, Mary, knowing about the technology and its inner workings is not enough. You need human sources. And in the Israel story, of course, in China and here in the United States, we really wanted to make sure that our sources were comfortable talking with us. So often this involved, combing through LinkedIn to find former officials, relying really on word of mouth and the trust of, longtime sources we all had who had been in and out of government and in and out of technology companies to guide us to people with actual knowledge of how these systems worked. And then, of course, we can get into this later, but crucially, we wanted to make sure that we could tell narrative visual stories that focused on the people impacted. So, Uyghur people in China who had faced these kinds of surveillance systems and been imprisoned, people in Lebanon who had actually undergone one of these bombing campaigns. And in the Border Patrol story, people who had been pulled over, as you mentioned, Byron, as a result of this algorithm deciding that they were suspicious.
And Garance, I think some of the people you tracked down were more willing to talk because they were out of the country. Is that right?
Yeah,
They were
that
no
was a
longer in the
surprising
US.
piece of this. Yes, absolutely. I think that,
Mhm.
under this particular environment, we've all been thinking very creatively about how to talk to sources in a way that's comfortable for them. And in this case, it sort of involved thinking about the United States as a foreign correspondent. So finding people who were outside of the US who were therefore more comfortable talking about what had happened to them here because they had already undergone sort of, the worst of their fears, right? And so, for example, this particular man, Luis Barrios, who had been pulled over while he was actually he was not pulled over. His colleague was pulled over as a result of this Border Patrol um, technology, was much more comfortable talking about his colleague's experience since he was already in Mexico. And so I think that that really forced us to think creatively about how to find people in ways where they felt safe talking. I know you thought a lot about that as well, Dake.
Jake, let me pursue that one a little bit further because I think when it comes to sourcing and really getting any information, China is a world unto itself. And so I think the common image is that China really is sort of an authoritarian black box. It's hard to get any information at all. It's a monolith, and, let alone persuade people to talk to you. So I'm hoping, Dake, you can tell us more on 2 points. The first on sourcing. How did you find sources in China and how did you protect them? And the second on navigating the Chinese bureaucracy. How did you get into the black box?
Right. So let me tackle the second question first, actually, the black box. I like to talk about this because I think it's a common idea that is very widespread and discourages people from even trying to start, which I think is an unfortunate mistake because it is incredible what you can find that is publicly available if you know where to look. It's probably beyond the scope of just this panel. I mean, I've had entire trainings around this, but I mean, essentially, the Chinese bureaucracy is extremely well organized, and they actually have a lot of information that they gather and collect and will put on various websites, such as court records. They'll have procurement tenders. They'll have statistical yearbooks. They'll have corporate records. I mean, the amount of information that is available is actually quite astonishing. Obviously, some of this information has been considered politically sensitive and may not be released, but there's still a lot of stuff to find if you go to Chinese websites, if you go to these document repertoires, and so on and so forth. So I often find that my work in terms of reporting on China involves a kind of interaction between going between documents and what we can find, and going with sources, because the sources will really tell you a lot more about what these policies or what these statistics actually look like on the ground, and that's very important. I always tell people I think sourcing in China is kind of like peeling an onion. You have people who are willing to talk to the foreign media, perhaps first approach. So oftentimes those are just people who are foreigners, right? Like they're experts on China for various reasons. They've been working in China for 20, 30 years, foreign executives who used to be in China, academics, so on and so forth. Or they're, Chinese, former officials or engineers or company executives who no longer live in China and are based outside of the country and therefore are also much more willing to talk to journalists. And you can actually use China's opacity to your advantage because information is power. Oftentimes, the country often runs on rumors, I think, like rumors about, oh, what policy is going on, oh, what is going on in China. So, as a journalist, you actually have a certain inbuilt advantage because you can offer that tantalizing promise of more information, which I think is not
Gossip,
limited just to
Dake.
China. Oh, yes, it's gossip. Yeah. I suspect, Byron in DC also knows very well how this operates, but it also works in China. And then, obviously you start with that first layer and then you start peeling it back. You ask people for introductions, you make it very clear what you're looking for, and it always surprises me how far you can actually go. I mean, obviously there's some pretty hard limitations. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to get people inside the government to talk to you directly. I mean, that's an incredible risk. But the other thing is actually, if you put your public information out there, your contact information, and I know that might not necessarily be convenient for everyone, but I have always been surprised by the number of people inside China, sometimes in position of power, who are willing to contact me directly because, as Mary, as you said, China is not a monolith. There are various competing branches of the government, various competing officials, various competing interest groups, and sometimes they're not happy with what's going on in China. And so if you provide that, but they don't know where to turn to, and the foreign media can be kind of the place of last resort. Obviously, there's all these internal channels by which they can kind of register their dissatisfaction. But when they really feel like there's nowhere else to turn, they know that the foreign media is the one place where the Chinese authorities cannot censor them. So sometimes they will contact us directly.
Jake's approach has been enlightening to me in one respect, in that, as he says, it's not a monolith, it's a vast society of human beings. And like human beings everywhere, they fight and they're jealous of each other and they want to get back at each other. And there are fallings out, and they're like, well, don't write about me, but I have absolutely no problem if you write about so and so over there. So that I think was good to know. Dave, I also wanted to ask you in particular, how did you protect sources in this? And indeed, I mean, the AP got harassed in China as well. Can you deal a little bit with, with Dake, the question we often get is, how is it that you have not been thrown out of China yet?
That's a really, really good question. I'm not
Yeah.
entirely sure I know the answers to that one either, to be honest with you. But I will say that I think being a foreign correspondent in China, someone said this to me very early on, and I think it's very true. It's like having a ring of fire around you. You yourself are protected, but anyone who gets too close to you
Um,
gets burned. And I think that's pretty spot on. So we have almost a weird kind of quasi-diplomatic immunity status of some sort. We're managed under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, and we're almost treated as though we are part, like, like a branch of a foreign government or something, although obviously we are not. But that does confer certain benefits, which is that we are treated with a certain mixture of respect and fear. And if you know how that works, then you can work. I mean, the biggest thing is I don't worry about my personal safety. I do think the worst thing that can happen is that I personally get thrown out of the country. I'm a lot more concerned about the safety of the sources that I speak to. And honestly, I mean, with China, there can be quite a lot of gray areas, but I mean, there's all the obvious precautions. I mean, obviously you have to use a lot of encryption. I mean, I'm incredibly paranoid about my electronic devices, and I've studied every single possible way of securing all my communications, and also things like making sure that you don't write your interviewees' names down in your notes, because in the off chance that your computer does get cracked, even if they do see your notes, you still aren't exposing someone, for example, right? But also, meeting people outside of China, and there's just a lot of nuanced things. Maybe too much detail to get into on this call, but just a quick one, for example, if where you're in China matters a lot. If you're meeting someone in Beijing, for example, the local authorities in Beijing don't seem to care very much about what we're doing, because I think largely it's because there's, tens of thousands of diplomats that they're much more concerned about than us. But the moment you go out into the provinces, all of a sudden you're like, the scary foreign journalist coming to the local county town, and the county party secretary is very concerned about what you will write, and they will send, thugs or police or whoever it is to go and watch you and whoever you are talking to. And so there's a lot of these kinds of nuances when it comes to interacting with sources, that plays a role there. So yeah, I think I'll.
Jake, how were AP reporters also harassed in China? I mean, in terms of, was it just that you were followed around by the thugs? I mean, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it can come in all sorts of different ways. I do have to say I have not gotten the worst of it, which again is kind of interesting. I think there. So, I mean, for example, I mean, with this project specifically, when we went to the visit the Youngs, who are the kind of the main characters of the first piece, we were being watched by the authorities because the Youngs are under surveillance, as we detail, very heavy surveillance. So they noticed when we visited, and they promptly showed up and intercepted us at one point and hauled us away to a local conference hall where they proceeded to have a meeting with us, where they expressed concern about, what we were doing, and they basically wanted to tell their side of the story, which we didn't publish because they made it clear that they wanted it to be all off the record. So I won't go into what they said here. But there's stuff like this, but there's often quite a bit of, again, because we have this kind of almost quasi-diplomatic status. There's actually a surprising amount of room to kind of push back or to appeal to higher authorities within China. For example, you can say, oh, well, according to Chinese law, we are allowed to report in these areas. And if you are not okay with that, then we're going to call the foreign ministry in Beijing. And that implicit threat of involving higher authorities can actually, give you a certain amount of space to push back. Um, I also think that being just having a base level of respect or cordiality towards the officials and not letting them, kind of get to you is actually quite important because you have to remember that it's not personal, right? When the government, whenever there's some government authority, state security or police or officials or whoever it is that's approaching you, it's their job, right? I mean, you may not like the fact that it's their job to intercept you or monitor you or, somehow impede your reporting. But it's also not because they hate you personally as a human being. And so I often find that if you treat those people with a basic degree of respect and understanding that this is simply their job and this is what they have to do, that actually gets you pretty far. Because once they recognize that you're treating them as a person, they'll also reciprocate back and not necessarily, treat you with hostility. So there's a lot of things like that.
I wanted to ask everyone, please feel free to post questions in the chat. And in a few minutes, we will go to questions, and we'd be very interested to hear what you're thinking about and what you'd like to know about. Um, in the meantime, one other thing I wanted to touch on. So this project focuses a lot on AI and surveillance technology. So it seems only right that we talk a little bit about how we used AI. So Garance and Byron, I'm going to throw that one to you guys to start with. So Garance, you going to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm based, excuse me, in San Francisco, where, of course, AI is on all the billboards and how it'll change our lives. And, we wanted to approach this reporting with an openness to how these technologies could also help us do our work more efficiently. And so the Trump administration had been putting out just a huge number of contracts for bid on sam.gov. And we thought, wouldn't it be more efficient to see if we could scrape the sam.gov website and then get an AI generated summary of what each of these contracts was seeking? There's a huge amount of money from the One Big Beautiful Bill, for example. DHS was seeking a lot of technology. Byron and I were really trying to keep track of all the different technological systems. And so our colleague on the data team wrote a scraper using an R script and then just pulled in from the sam.gov API, a drip of these contracts with an AI generated summary. Now, to be clear, following AP standards, we never inserted any of that AI generated summary into our copy, but it gave us sort of a ballpark idea of what kinds of technologies the Department of Homeland Security was seeking. And then, as Byron mentioned, these very dry policy documents about the privacy concerns that DHS had also were something that we thought was fair game to summarize using AI just to give ourselves a sense of what they contained. If you want to talk a little bit more about that, Byron.
Yeah, I mean, I used a couple of commercial off the shelf, widely available AI tools to do things like summarization or writing basic web scrapers. So like Grant's just said, at one point I downloaded all of the what are called privacy impact assessments, which is a DHS policy document documenting every single system that DHS uses. They write this long thing about how what it does, what's in it, and how to mitigate privacy concerns. And there's also a document called a SORN, which is a system of record notice. And these are all extremely dry policy documents from DHS, but we put them into Notebook LM, which is a particularly useful tool because when it spits out, when you ask questions of it, it will actually definitively link to the line in the document that it's deriving the answer from. And so you as a journalist can have a lot more assurance that when it answers something, you can actually then click back to the primary source and make sure that it's true. And again, we largely use this mostly for our own understanding and to kind of save some time, and to ask questions of a large volume of documents. And then another point, we built a very, very simple web scraper, for all of the flock cameras. So what we had found at some point was that the license plate reader company Flock had these disclosure portals, and they were like transparency dot flock dot, and then it was the town's name. And so we could search that top level domain for anyone that reported sharing data with the Department of Homeland Security. So we built a really simple web scraper to pull that down. And then we had a summer intern who actually sort of manually checked it. So we're not sort of using AI for writing stories or anything like that, but the ability to get new forms of data from the web quickly, and to summarize large volumes of documents, as long as you're doing it responsibly, as long as you're not accepting the output as gospel truth, is very helpful, especially in the early stages and the prospecting stages of the reporting.
Thank you, Byron and Garance. One thing I wanted to mention that I felt I learned from this project, one of the most exhausting pieces of the process was, of course, dealing with what dozens of very rich and very powerful tech companies who tried to intimidate us in all sorts of ways. I mean, I remember a memorable call Dake and I had, with the vice president. They really pushed hard. So one thing I learned from this process, normally calling the companies and asking for a response is one of the last things we do. So, because we don't want them to get ahead of us, et cetera, et cetera. But this project made me wonder if it might be worthwhile to do it earlier in the process. The companies were actually very useful in passing on dirt about other companies. As in, they would say, oh, we definitely don't do that, but you really should check out so and so and what they did on so and so at this time and at this place. And we were like, okay, we will. And we did. So that was one thing I learned that sort of made me think about our timing a little bit. And then before we open to questions, I just wanted to give a shout out to, I mean, this was, as Byron said, very much a team effort involving people across the AP. I also wanted to give a shout out in particular to our great visual team. And that would be David Goldman, Marshall Ritzel, Serginho Roosblad, Felipe Dana. Garance, would you give us just a 2-minute summary of what they did and how it added to the project?
Absolutely. So I think with this particular project, we were all thinking, how can we visualize these surveillance technologies that are really meant to go unseen? How can we help the public understand not only who they're impacting, but what they look like? And so our colleague Felipe Dana had this brilliant idea to kit out a Sony camera to recognize infrared beams of light. So those are the beams of light that, say, your iPhone emits, for facial recognition purposes, to measure the quadrants of your cheeks, etc., as well as the lights that automated license plate reader systems emit when trying to capture the numbers and letters on your license plates. And so then he and David Goldman, and other colleagues in China actually used this camera to capture these actually beautiful images of the infrared light that really brought forward much more of a sense as to how these technologies work and impact our daily lives and most intimate details, our facial features. And then, as I mentioned earlier, our colleague Ross Franklin drove all around Arizona to get otherwise pretty boring photos of hidden automated license plate readers, but he made them really just fun, if that's possible, right? He took pictures of orange traffic cones where there's a secret camera hiding inside. And so I think that that really brought home to our audiences that these technologies are not rocket science, that it's actually something that you yourself can understand. And then finally, our colleague Marshall Ritzel on the illustrations team just did a beautiful visual presentation on some raw video footage and used an object classifier to help the public understand on a YouTube video, how these systems sort what's a truck, what's a train, etc. So I think we really all benefited so much from that creativity.
Mary, I think you're muted.
That was embarrassing. I'm sorry, everyone. I am no longer muted. I was going to say, let's move on to questions. And please, everyone, put your questions in, and the reporters will be happy to try and answer them. Let's start with this first question. When reporting information from an important but confidential source, how do you present the facts clearly while protecting the source's identity? Why don't I throw that one to Dake and Byron, because I think you guys would deal with it, in different ways. Dake, you're up first.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the ways in which we do this, especially it's really more an art than a science. It's often case by case. Various sources have various degrees of comfort. Also, depending on their personal situation, are they inside the country? Are they outside the country? How much of a threat would it be if their identity was exposed, so on and so forth. But a couple concrete ways of dealing with that is one, you can interview a bunch of people. And then you can summarize what, say if you interviewed 15, former officials and engineers who worked on Xinjiang's, back end surveillance system. You can put in, generally speaking, what they have told you, um, in a few graphs, and there's just no way they're going to be able to figure out who told you these things, right? Because it's all kind of mixed up in all of those different interviews together. So I think that's one of the easiest ways of dealing with that kind of situation. In other cases, it's kind of like a scale, right? How much detail you want to provide, and what kind of, balanced with the kind of information you're trying to provide. Obviously, things identifying places like names, but then also gender, location, job title, stuff like that, all considerations, right? I mean, if you say that this is a, ethnic Kazakh who is from this particular city doing this kind of job, but you don't mention their name, obviously that could give away something. If you say it's just someone who was familiar with the back end of this operation, it's much harder to figure out who that person is, right? But I know with anonymity, we generally try to avoid it and have some named sources, and we generally build the stories around our named sources. They're just much better as characters as well, because if you can see their face, if you can see their name, you get much more of a sense of who they are as a person, as a reader, and it's much more compelling. But yeah, I mean, sometimes that is kind of unavoidable. So I would say those are the two ways I can think of off the top of my head.
Byron, do you want to throw in anything on this point?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we took a similar approach when we were reporting on this stuff in the United States. There are similar dynamics. Luckily for this particular series, nothing we were writing about was classified. So nobody was going to prison for speaking to us, but there are still reputational risks. In many instances, we were talking to law enforcement officials, and there is that sort of thin blue line that police officers don't like to necessarily speak out about what other departments are doing because they feel like they're acting in the name of public safety. So unfortunately, we did have to use a lot of anonymous sources, and The way we dealt with trying to protect identities was similar. We talked to a lot of people, first of all. Second of all, a lot of what they told us was actually backed up in documents. And so that was quite helpful. And often vice versa. Sometimes the documents led us to sources who could illustrate and confirm what was happening in the documents and add more meat to the bone. And so, for this particular project, while we still had serious source protection concerns, it's sort of lesser than um, other sort of national security stories. And I will add on to what Dake was talking about source protection. Like this stuff does come up also in the United States. Like again, we we're not talking about people who will be jailed for talking to us, but we certainly don't ever want to expose our sources. So I think when Garance and I both took trips during the reporting of this, we were very conscious about not writing people's names down in computer systems. I literally used a burner cell phone to cross international borders, going on vacation to Iceland because I didn't want to carry anything with my journalistic notes across the border and subject it to search by DHS while actively reporting a critical story on DHS. And I think Garance had the same experience at some point, or maybe it makes that a routine practice. So these kind of source protection concerns, while not as dramatic as in China, definitely exist here in the United States.
So let me throw the next question from Bill Holstein. Bill says, and let me throw this one to you, girls. Have any of you looked at the TikTok deal? The big tech boys, Allison, for example, secured 80% control of TikTok USA, but ByteDance seems to be still managing the algorithms and recommendation engines, could still have access to the data stored on Oracle servers. Any insights? Garance, this one's yours.
Thanks so much for the question. I mean, I think we all were very interested in that deal, and touched on it a bit in some of the reporting looking at the relationship between the US government and the Chinese government and how the US government has really sold uh, a whole variety of different technologies, aided in the sale of those technologies to governments over time. And I think that with ByteDance, the particular thing that we were looking at is, it comes in this moment where Trump and Xi have had two very important meetings, both this year and last. And I think these issues are only going to continue to evolve in new and interesting ways, especially as tech companies become so central to this administration. And so I'd say it's one that we're keeping an eye on, but like every deal, it has its nuances.
Thanks, girls. Next question from Amrad. You clearly had to balance sourcing and data and risk in a story of this scale. What were the hardest judgment calls along the way? So I will throw that open to everyone, but I actually wanted to talk about one aspect of this. I think one of the things that honestly was scariest about this project is, again, we were facing dozens of companies who frankly have a lot more money and a lot more lawyers than the AP does. So that meant, among other things, that we went through a very rigorous legal process. And very rigorous legal process. And I think it would be safe to say that most of us face a much more difficult environment today than we did, say, 3 or 4 years ago in that respect. In that, everything we publish now has that much more risk. And, obviously we went ahead with the series anyway, but a lot of vetting went into it. Other Dake, anything you would like to jump into in terms of judgment calls? One thing that might be interesting is the Young family. They were already being scrutinized by police, and we brought a whole lot more attention to them. And obviously, you and I talked about concerns of, was that going to be a problem?
Right. Yeah, I was going to say one of the hardest judgment calls was actually part editorial, part sourcing, which was who was going to be the main character of the first story. We went, and that was partially an editorial decision. I think initially we had some earlier drafts that maybe centered Xinjiang at the very top, but it was felt as though that was too possibly too dated. I mean, some of those anecdotes were, dating back 7, 8 years ago. And we really wanted something where it brought people into the now. This is happening immediately. But then you encounter this thorny issue of, okay, but if you're talking about something that's happening now, and you have to have a person who's named and willing to expose their identity, and it's happening in China, then you get to the risky part, right? And the thing is, in China, I think this is the thing with sourcing in China is most people that you talk to do not want to take risks. They are conditioned to avoid talking about anything political because there is a very well-oiled machine that will possibly get you into, a kind of sliding scale of trouble depending on how much you push various narratives or, stories that might cut against the party line. But there are a group of people that they really want their story out there, pretty much no matter. And that there is also a scale there. I mean, there are some people, I think I mentioned earlier, journalists anonymously and leak information. And there are also, but they don't want to go public with their identity. And then there's people who are basically willing to tell everything. They've accepted that this is the price that they're going to pay, and they know what the risks are. And I think when we're selecting people who we feature in our stories, we really want to make sure that they are fully well informed of what they're getting themselves into, right? So with the Youngs, I mean, this was a family that was publicly advocating for their own case for years. The daughter is living overseas in Japan, and she was operating a Twitter account that was not very well noticed. And she was really actively trying to get more attention to the plight of her family. And so, in her particular case, I mean, I went and I met her in person, and I talked to her, and I told her very directly, I mean, I don't know if you've been featured in foreign media reporting before, but this attention may not necessarily uh, make the government more favorable to your family. It could actually backfire in some ways. But she was very, very clear that she very much wanted that attention nonetheless, and that's what made us comfortable with moving forward with featuring that family.
From an editorial point of view, I was already convinced, but I mean, the thing that really, really got was when Dake sent me a photo of one of the Youngs. He'd been beaten up, and there's this guy, he's lying in a hospital bed, he can't move, and there's a surveillance camera attached to his IV drip. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's this is the family we want to go with. Um, and that actually segs nicely into the next question. One of the questions your OPC judging panel had was this: were the actions by American companies merely historical in nature, or are they still happening today? This is something we spent a lot of time talking about. And one of the things that I think really made the project come alive, it was a big question we had, as in what is going on today. And so I would say two things in that the impact of this is still ongoing in that China is selling all this stuff. But I think I would ask Dake and Garance to talk a little bit about this one. Dake, you want to talk about the present day influence of these companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a live issue. One of the things that was really helpful was all this stuff with NVIDIA and the lobbying to sell chips to China, kind of erupted as we were moving the series to its conclusion last year. And I think that just illustrated what is a decades-old kind of dilemma for American companies operating in China, but very much a dilemma that continues to this day, which is, you're basically looking for access, but you have to sell or give up a certain amount of technology in the process of doing so. And so it's very much a live issue in that regard. And another thing that we actually found in our reporting also was that despite the fact that the number of sales have very much slowed quite dramatically for a number of reasons. There are still companies who have identified certain niches in the Chinese market that they're very happy to quietly, uh, continue to sell, so long as they're allowed to do so. And I think the clearest example of that were the cloud service companies. You have companies, AWS, for example, very much still providing cloud services to various Chinese companies that are involved in various surveillance technologies. And that's something that continues to this day. So those were all things that kind of surfaced in the course of our reporting. And in fact, the question of is this continuing to this day very much directed our reporting and helped us figure out that these were things that were going on.
We were very interested in that, and particularly in the fact that today, all around us, these companies were sharply rising in terms of news presence, in terms of the stock market. And as Dake mentioned, as we did the first story, there was a controversy about NVIDIA and what chips they were going to be allowed to sell to China. The interesting piece there was a group of almost 30 risk experts, etc., wrote in saying this software could be used for malicious reasons. And so, again, it was instructive to me in that this is a live issue today. What are we selling to China? How can it be used? How are the companies aware of how it can be used? So, Garance, I will send this one to you. Part of what was enlightening to me, certainly in the NVIDIA rule, was the role of the U.S. government. Can you talk a little bit about that role today and also that role historically?
Sure. No, and I think that again, the specifics of all of this was so important to us because we wanted to trace the details of that historical relationship between the US tech companies and the Chinese government, for example, but then bring our audiences up to the exact details of what was happening today. And we found a certain amount of continuity. So even as there was all of this tough talk about China, we found that the US government across five Republican and Democratic administrations had repeatedly allowed and even actively helped American firms to sell their technology to Chinese police and government agencies and surveillance campaigns. And for that particular story, we looked at how more than 100 lobbyists from tech companies and their trade associations, in recent years had been weighing in on a bill that would have closed what they had called a glaring loophole, in the words of US lawmakers, which was how exactly China was getting around some of these export bans on the sale of powerful American AI chips. And I think that we can see that this discussion really continues today with the Trump-Xi summit just now, with AI chips and, sort of American diplomacy around technology, around making sure that other countries use the American AI tech stack instead of the Chinese AI tech stack. Is we really sort of wanted to make sure that this reporting got people up to the minute on how this was impacting not only tech sales, but also the actions of our government here in the United States.
One other thing I wanted to mention in terms of, current influence today is, of course, that this surveillance technology is now being used by Silicon Valley companies being sold for use in wars, notably Gaza. And I want Garance, Michael Biesick, and Sam Mednick did a story about this that showed essentially there's a huge rise in the use of AI and the sales of American companies to Israel for use in AI that helps decide who lives and who dies. with surveillance technology. So I think that's another way in which the actions of American companies are very much pertinent today. Um, I do not any other questions that anyone would like to bring up, would like to put in the chat, would like us to discuss. Okay, it sounds like we don't have any. So I will ask our panelists then, do you have any final wrap-up thoughts, anything that you would like to bring up, that you would like people to be aware of, that you learned in doing this project? Okay, that sounds like
And I can tackle one, I can say one thing, which is
go
that
for
one
it.
thing I thought that was very important about this project was thinking about the scope of it. Initially when Yale and I were looking at these documents, you would see it's all about China. But I thought it was very important that we kind of broaden the aperture, so to widen the aperture, so to speak, and look at the implications worldwide. And one of the things that I'm very glad we managed to accomplish with this project was to look at the subject in a way that didn't conform neatly to any one narrative. Silicon Valley companies, for example, are very happy to point the finger at China and say, oh, China is this big, surveillance state, and they're doing all these things that are going against freedom, and therefore you should support us. And I think one of the things that the series has really illustrated is that actually the story is much more complicated than that. And it took just a little bit of, widening and looking around and looking at different places such as Nepal or such as Gaza or such as the US itself, in order to tell that story.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to add, per the previous discussion about is this still kind of ongoing or is this historical, that, the United States and the rest of Europe and the West remain very, very fertile ground for companies to sell similar systems into public safety and, national security um, agencies. And, we have seen a proliferation of very similar technologies in the United States that do risk scoring, that do analysis, that do evaluation, that can monitor the movement across entire cities. And of course, there's more civic space in the West to push back on them and to question them. And of course, we are democracies where city councils and county councils and state legislators get to make decisions with a lot more feedback from voters than in a more closed system. But these things are happening; they're unfolding daily, and there's tons of these surveillance vendors that are not doing dissimilar things to what's been documented abroad and want a foothold in the United States.
Yeah, and I'll just say we kept finding some kind of eerie parallels between, the risk score that was used in Xinjiang with the kinds of scoring that the algorithm here in the United States that we were looking at spat out, as well as just some of the mathematical ways in which the AI systems at use in war were, making these very, very consequential decisions that included whether people lived or died, included who was pulled over, who was put in a camp. And I think that, certainly there are always humans in the loop. There are always humans who are aiding these decisions. These tools don't make them in a vacuum. And I think that that's a really important thing for reporters to remember, that that leaves us all sorts of avenues for inquiry. And that if we make sure that our reporting is technically accurate and that we do so in a way that really, really places just a huge importance on the safety of our sources, there are many more such stories to be uncovered. And I think now is really the time, as we as journalists around the world see the prevalence of these technologies interceding in our daily lives.
Okay, we will wrap up there. So thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank you very much to all of you for listening. We really appreciate it. It's obviously a subject that we think is of great importance, and we hope the conversation will continue. Um, okay, we will wrap up there. Thanks very much. Bye.